There is a map drawn on gazelle skin that shows a coastline no human eye was supposed to have seen. It sits in a palace library in Istanbul, and along its bottom edge, curving out beneath the tip of South America, is a stretch of land with river valleys, bays, and mountain ranges. The problem is what that land is, because when you match those bays and valleys against modern data, they line up with the coast of Queen Maud Land in Antarctica. Not the Antarctica of today, buried under 2 kilometers of ice. The Antarctica underneath, the rock coastline you cannot see from a ship, from a plane, or from standing on the continent itself. A coastline that has been sealed under ice for thousands of years. And this map was signed and dated in the year 1513, more than 300 years before any human being is recorded as having laid eyes on Antarctica at all. It shows a land that was already frozen when it was drawn, as if someone had traced it before the ice arrived. Most people see this map in a museum caption and walk right past it. But hidden inside it is a detail that shouldn't exist, and it is not the only one. Because the man who drew it left a note in the margin in his own hand, telling us exactly where he got it. And that note leads somewhere no historian wants to follow. Stay with me, because in a moment, we are going to look at what he wrote at a second and third map that show the same impossible coast, and at what a Greek philosopher recorded about a drowned island 2,000 years before any of it. 3 clues. And the last one is the one nobody has been able to explain away. Start with the map itself. It was drawn by an Ottoman admiral named Piri Reis, a real man, a serious navigator, who compiled it from a stack of older charts he had access to as a naval officer. That part is not disputed. What is disputed is the bottom of the map. The mainstream reading is simple and reasonable. They say that strange southern landmass is just South America, bent sideways to fit the shape of the animal skin. Piri Reis ran out of room on the parchment, so he curved the coast of Argentina to the right to make it fit. Clean explanation. And for the top part of that curve, it probably holds. But that explanation has a problem. In 1949, a joint British and Swedish expedition ran a seismic survey across Queen Maud Land in Antarctica, bouncing shockwaves through the ice to map the solid rock underneath. When a professor named Charles Hapgood, a historian at the University of New Hampshire, laid the Piri Reis coastline against that subglacial survey, the bays and inlets matched, not vaguely. He and his students counted correspondence at dozens of specific points. The catch is brutal. In 1949, you needed shockwaves and a drilling team to see that coastline, because it is under a mile of ice. In 1513, you would have needed to see it before the ice was there at all. Hapgood wrote to the United States Air Force asking whether the map matched Antarctica's real subglacial geography, because the Air Force had the reconnaissance and the seismic data he did not. The reply he received, on official letterhead, agreed that the lower part of the map lined up with the Queen Maud Land coast, as revealed by the 1949 survey, and admitted they had no idea how a cartographer in 1513 could have known it. Sit with the size of that admission. A branch of the American military looked at a 500-year-old chart, compared it to a coastline that requires shockwaves and a drilling rig to see, and could not rule out that the chart was right. And Piri Reis was not guessing at the interior either. The map carries the outlines of rivers and highland ranges set back from the coast, the kind of inland detail you cannot infer by sailing past. You can only draw an interior like that if you have seen the land from above, or copied from someone who did. That is the first clue. A coastline drawn from above, accurate to features no one could survey until the 20th century. Hold on to it, because now we get to what Piri Reis actually wrote about his sources. Here is where it gets strange. Piri Reis did not claim to have discovered this land. He was honest to the point of self-incrimination. In the notes he inked directly onto the map, He says he built it from around 20 older source charts, and that some of them went back to the time of Alexander the Great. He mentions maps so ancient that by his own century, they were already relics. He was not the cartographer of that southern coast. He was a copyist. He was tracing something handed down to him from a source that was old when Rome was young. And this is the detail that should stop you cold. If Piri Reis copied that Antarctic coast from a chart already ancient in 1513, then the original had to be older still, old enough to predate the ice, which means somebody mapped that continent while its coast was bare rock and open river valleys. And then, at some point, that knowledge was copied, recopied, passed hand to hand across empires, until it landed on the desk of an Ottoman admiral who no longer understood what he was looking at. If you are the kind of person who needs to know who drew the original, subscribe now, because this channel hunts down lost sources and buried expeditions every single week. And this trail is a long way from cold. Because Piri Reis is not the only map that shows it. That is the second clue, and it is the one that breaks the coincidence argument. If it were just Piri Reis, you could call it a lucky smear of ink, but there are others. In 1531, a French mathematician named Oronce Finé drew a world map with a full southern continent at the bottom, and its shape, its rivers, its interior mountains sit uncomfortably close to the real outline of Antarctica beneath the ice. In 1737, a French geographer, Philippe Buache, published a map of a southern land split into two masses by a waterway through the middle. For centuries, that looked like a fantasy. Then, modern radar surveys revealed that Antarctica really is two land masses, a larger eastern one and a smaller western one, divided by a deep basin that would be open water if the ice ever melted. Buache drew that division more than 80 years before anyone officially found the continent, and he claimed, like the others, to be working from older sources rather than direct observation. Nobody in 1737 had sailed those waters. Nobody had radar. And yet the channel is there, under the ice, right where he put it. 3 maps, 3 different map makers, 3 different countries, and centuries, all reaching back to older sources, all showing a version of the same frozen coast that no one living in their time could possibly have seen. Not similar, not inspired by one another. The same land, again and again, drawn from something older that keeps not being there when we go looking for it. And that brings us to the third clue, the one that turns a stack of old maps into something much larger. Because there is a written account of a great land in the far ocean that was mapped, measured, and then lost underwater. And it is far older than any of these charts. Around 360 BCE, a Greek philosopher set down a report he said came through his own family line from an Athenian statesman named Solon, who had heard it from temple priests in Egypt. The priests told Solon of an island power that existed 9,000 years before their own time. An island, they said, larger than Libya and Asia combined, lying beyond the Pillars of Heracles, out past the edge of the known world. For decades, scholars dismissed the whole thing as a moral fable, a made-up parable about pride and punishment. And maybe that is all it is. But read what the account actually describes, and it stops sounding like a fable and starts sounding like a survey. It describes a landmass so large it dwarfs 2 continents, positioned out in the great ocean from which you could reach other lands. That is not how Greeks described their own tidy Mediterranean islands. That is a description of a continent across an ocean. It describes a ring of mountains sheltering a central plain, and beyond the whole civilization, cold and open sea. It describes walls faced in red, white, and black stone, quarried straight from the ground, the exact banded volcanic rock you find where a continent's crust is young and restless. It describes a gleaming metal the account calls orichalcum, flashing like fire, a real copper-based alloy, not a fantasy. Since ingots of a copper-zinc metal, answering that description, were pulled from a Bronze Age shipwreck off Sicily in 2015. These are not the details of a made-up morality tale. They are the details of an inventory. And then it describes the end. Not a slow decline, a single event, violent earthquakes and floods, and in one terrible day and night, the entire island sank beneath the sea and vanished, leaving only impassable shoals of mud where it had been. The mainstream reads that as pure invention. But look at what we now know sits at the bottom of the planet. A continent larger than Europe, ringed by the tallest coastal mountains along its edges, out beyond every ancient sailor's horizon. A continent that was not always frozen. The rock under that ice holds fossilized forests, coal beds, and the remains of a temperate world. Geologists have pulled fossil ferns, tree trunks, and even the traces of ancient river deltas out of Antarctic rock. Antarctica had rivers, it had valleys, it had a bare coastline, the exact coastline those three impossible maps appear to trace. Modern radar surveys, the ones that finally let us map the ground under the ice, revealed a hidden landscape down there of canyons and mountain ranges as dramatic as anything on the surface of the Earth, along with lakes of liquid water sealed off from the sun for longer than our species has existed. That is what sits beneath the white, a whole buried world. And then the ice came, not slowly, in the memory of the people who may have known it, but as a world-ending descent of white, a single, catastrophic loss of a whole land to a force that buried it and left nothing you could sail across. The account says, the survivors remembered an island swallowed in a day and a night. What does a civilization say when its warm homeland is taken by advancing ice and rising seas? And only a handful escape to tell it to people who will retell it for 9,000 years, until a philosopher writes it down. Now, let us slow down and be honest with each other. Does any of this prove there was a lost civilization living on Antarctica, mapping it from the air before the ice? No. And you should distrust anyone who tells you it is settled. The skeptics have real points, and they deserve a fair hearing. The subglacial match Hapgood found has been challenged. Later analysts argued that the correspondences are looser than he claimed, and that some of his alignments required bending the map to make them fit. The bottom of the Piri Reis chart genuinely can be read as a distorted South America, and Piri Reis even scribbled notes on that landmass describing hot weather, huge snakes, and parrots, which sounds like the tropics, not a polar coast. The idea that Antarctica was ice-free within human memory is not supported by the ice cores, which say the ice sheet is far, far older than any human map. Ice does not melt and refreeze on the schedule this theory needs. Every one of these maps has a conventional explanation, and those explanations matter. But here is what the tidy version still cannot do. It cannot explain why three separate map makers, working from older sources they openly admitted copying, all placed a large, detailed southern continent on their charts centuries before it was found, and why the details keep matching a landscape we could only confirm with radar. It cannot explain Buache's dividing channel through a continent everyone thought was solid, drawn generations before the split under the ice was known. And it cannot explain why an Egyptian temple, whose priests kept records reaching back thousands of years, preserved a specific account of a vast land beyond the ocean that was mapped, that was measured, and that was lost in a single catastrophe. They were not writing fantasy geography. They were describing a place. The question is not whether these people were imagining. The question is what they were remembering. Even the grounded version of this is extraordinary. At the very least, human beings preserved, across thousands of years and a dozen hands, a memory of a coastline that no living person in their era could see. Whether it came from a lost survey, a drowned culture, or a chain of copied maps whose origin is simply gone, something real sits at the source of it. Something was mapped. Something was remembered. And if even the careful version is true, then our history is missing a chapter, a stretch of time in which someone charted the far edges of the world and then disappeared so completely that we spent 500 years calling their handiwork a mistake on gazelle skin. The continent is still there, larger than Europe, sealed under 2 kilometers of ice. Its true coastline hidden beneath a weight of white that no eye can pierce and no ship can reach. Under that ice sit lakes that have not touched sunlight in millions of years, valleys that were once warm, and a landscape that matches, bay for bay, a map that should not exist. The maps are still in their archives. The account is still in its manuscripts. And the coastline they all seem to trace is still down there in the dark, frozen, silent, and unexcavated, waiting under the ice for someone to finally go and look. If you want to see what else the ancient world charted and then buried, watch the next investigation on screen right now.